Well, welcome. My name is Teresa Ingalls, and I wanted to talk today about ways that a business in cultural resource management can use FileMaker. And it was really interesting being at the Tuesday special session where they announced the new category for FileMaker being the Workplace Innovation Platform. Because when they made the announcement, my first thought was, of course that's what it is. This is not news to me. And I think that that's the whole point. Like, it is what it is. And at least for our industry of cultural resource management and our company, it really hits the mark because FileMaker is starting to kind of transform all of our business processes. So before I get into all of that, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I am a registered professional archaeologist. I have been doing archaeology for 12 years in various capacities. I started out as an archaeology technician analyzing animal bones from across the southeast. So that kind of looks like looking at food remains and ritual offerings from ceremonies, grave goods like shell pendants, that kind of thing. After that, I went to graduate school at the University of Hawaii. And if anyone is looking into going to graduate school anytime soon, I highly recommend it. It was a good life choice to go to Hawaii for that period of time. I ended up, after graduate school, at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu as the archaeology collections manager there. And that was actually my first introduction to FileMaker. We had just started using, someone else had built and developed, and we had just started using FileMaker to keep track of our collections for a few sites across the island of Hawaii. After that, I moved into the contract archaeology world, also known as cultural resource management. That's what we call CRM. Every time I hear it used elsewhere, it always throws me off. So that's what we call CRM, and I worked in Phoenix for a couple of years as our GIS mapping director, as well as the director of our lab work there, processing artifacts from the field all the way through to our curation facilities. Again, I was interacting with FileMaker in that setting. We had, as soon as I came in, had just started using FileMaker to do our fieldwork methodology in that context. So again, I got to interact with it, not in a development sense, but I was using it. And now my job title is the Digital Data Manager for a company called New South Associates. And New South is headquartered outside of Atlanta, Georgia. We have offices kind of all over the Southeast, but that's where we're headquartered. And we are a women-owned small business, and we consult with companies about cultural resources, specifically archaeological sites and architectural resources like historic buildings. If you aren't familiar with this type of consultation work, you're not alone. Basically, my whole career has been explaining that, yes, we do archaeology in America too, and I don't go to Egypt and do most of my work over there with the pyramids. So, yeah, we have essentially, it might be helpful to know we have a lot of federal and state laws in our country that require that projects get a go-ahead from a professional before they can start breaking ground. So this includes doing environmental studies and impact assessments for air and noise and cultural assessments. So we do the cultural impact assessments and give recommendations to our clients about how they need to proceed in order to beat the regulations out there. So I was actually hired at this company 1 year ago this week to help them take what was essentially a paper-based collection system into the digital age. We needed something that could handle complexity, was friendly to both the users and the developer, which was me, that was my requirement. And it could also be used offline, since we have a lot of really remote project locations where people are doing digs in the swamps of Louisiana, that kind of thing. So I ended up researching about 50 different software options and created this huge spreadsheet of all of the features and the pricing, and at the end of that research, recommended FileMaker to our board as the platform to use for doing this. And essentially, it really came down to that it was, in short, the best price for the most customization, and it was really friendly to new developers like myself. So these databases I'm going to show you kind of glimpses into are the first ones I've ever developed. And so since you guys are the experts, I would really appreciate if you see anything, I would appreciate your feedback on these. And actually one of the things that was another reason we went with FileMaker is because of the support that you can get through the online FileMaker community. So that was really important, going to the discussion boards for troubleshooting during the initial first-time development for me. So to talk about how we are using FileMaker in our work, I wanted to use a recent project of ours as a case study. We were hired to do the cultural impact assessment and testing of this large square block in a downtown area. The block had been chosen for a large development project. You can see in the designer drawing the size of the building that they were going to be building. And due to the destructive nature of a building project like this, it's important that we research whether or not there was something significant on that site before the demolition started, and learn about it as much as we possibly could. So this project was done in two different stages. The first stage was the background research by our historian Robbie Jones into the history of the parcel, and the second was the archaeological testing to try to locate some of those historic features so more could be documented about them. The kind of features we were looking for might include historic house floors or building foundations or even old brick roads, cobblestone roads, that kind of thing. So we're going to start with the first phase, the history research. We developed an architectural history survey database for all of our historians to use on iPads in the field, and obviously on FileMaker Pro and laptops back in the office. And in our industry, there are real challenges with the variations in state requirements for this kind of work. And since we work all across the Southeast, this is something we have to think about. There are differences in state site forms, obviously, but there are also differences in file naming conventions and terminology, and even reporting styles. So everybody wants something slightly different. We also have the challenge of being, like I said, a multi-state company. So one person might end up doing the field work and then pass it along to another employee in a different office location to do the report writing itself. So we've addressed those challenges by using the flexibility and customization of FileMaker to create variations in the database based on the different states that we work in. And at the beginning of this particular project, I worked with the State Historic Commission Office and sat down with them and gave them a chance to air their concerns about the new system that we were creating, make sure that the data that we were collecting was going to conform to their standards, and explain for them what that meant. And it's really important in our work that we keep the relationships with the State Historic Preservation Office really good. We try to avoid trickle-down frustrations where if the state is unhappy or frustrated, or if our clients are unhappy, or even our staff are unhappy with discrepancies between the database and state regulations, that can be a mess. It means longer review of our reports, and it can be eventually lead to eroded trust in relationships. So each state looks different for what they want. North Carolina requires that we submit everything in an Access database in the end. So we still want to use FileMaker, so we just have adjusted how we collect the data. We have the same like field naming conventions, and we've organized it in a way that once we export the information out of it, it goes into their system really fluidly. We also use the terminology specified by each state for various descriptions like buildings and architectural styles. And you would think that would be the same across the board, but it isn't, and we have to account for that. When it comes to reporting, we created clones of the state site forms and put them into print layouts in the database. And because there's so much variety in how people want information to be given to them, how these forms have to look. We build it into the print layout so our staff is freed from the burden of having to remember what everybody requires since they move across state lines so frequently. And this has saved us a ton of time in training and allowed our staff to just work and go to a new state and pick up a project that someone couldn't do and not have to keep track of all of the differences from what they're used to doing. Just pick up the database, know they're in the right state, and know that the terminology is going to be how the state's going to want it at the end. So back to this project, this case study, Robbie started out by surveying the properties surrounding the empty parcel and doing background map research about what used to be on that block of land back in the day. So I think our earliest maps went back to 1768 for the area. Very, very interesting to look at all of his research. And he entered the details for all of the properties into the database and noted the buildings that were still existing around the parcel and on the parcel. There were very few still on the parcel. And the map on the left there is really, really crowded, but it does still show like the results of his findings, the footprints of buildings like old slave houses, brick alleys, a movie theater. There was a funeral home on the property originally, and lots of other historic use. So this new synthesized map and the database together, he gave those to the archaeologists to figure out how to plan for the next phase of work, where would be the best place to test for archaeological features. And so they decided to put their trenches where they were most likely to hit something that was there. And you can see those as, hopefully, there's like long red blocks on there. Those were the 3 trench locations they went with. In this photo, you can see Robbie. He's our historian. He's consulting with the archaeologists during the trenching phase to talk about what they were likely finding below the surface as they're digging. And he could quickly bring up the database and the map on the iPad and show them what was in that area. And then because our database is on an AWS server, it's hosted, he could leave and go back to the office, and they could still have all of his notes, still have the map, and they could work off of that to do some on-the-fly interpretation of the features coming up. So segueing over to the archaeology and phase 2 of the project. Our archaeological projects have very different challenges than our history projects. One of those challenges is the complex spatial nature of excavation. So let me unpack that for just a second and look at a quick example. We're going to look at a very childlike drawing I did for you all. Of what this looks like in practice. So this is, let's say we dig a trench to see what's under the surface of an area. In this case, it's all a paved parking lot. This is a bird's eye view of that trench, and the idea is to stand in the trench and look at the sidewall and see the layers of soil and artifacts and any other brick foundations that we call features in the sidewall. And this is what you can see that I was doing in that earlier photograph. I'm standing in a trench, recording what I see in the sidewall. And then if we do see a cultural feature, we might open up an area right next to it, a unit, and examine it further. And this involves digging that controlled square section down in layers. And this is what you see on all of the archaeology movies, everybody digging in little squares that are all like lined off. That's what this is doing. And that, in the end, that feature may end up extending across a large area and containing many sub-features. This is sort of like the outline of a house with a cooking pit in the middle and post holes along the edge. And in the end, a trench might be associated with multiple units and features, and one unit might have multiple features, and one feature could extend across multiple units, and it can get really complex. And so the database needed to be able to capture that kind of spatial complexity that exists in reality, and so that was one of our challenges. And then, of course, what everybody talks about, there's the paper pile-up challenge. We definitely have that. The traditional way of recording all of this is on paper forms for each individual thing, where you have a feature form and a unit form and a different form for everything, and a bag list and a photo list. And on small projects, it's not a huge hassle, but you can imagine as your project area grows and you have lots of units and features, that this can quickly descend into chaos as soon as you're trying to piece it all together at the end of the project just to get your end of field work report out. We also needed our solution to reduce human error and to be able to go mobile, to be able to go offline, and to be user-friendly, because we tend to mobilize temporary field crew for every project that we do. So this is how we're meeting those challenges for our archaeology database. We have built the spatial complexity of excavation into the table and relationships structure. Not only do we allow the crew to drill down to an exact and specific context, but they're also able to associate that with multiple contexts. On the end, what this looks like in the relationships graph is essentially a lot of join tables to get at that complexity. So this is our excavation main page, and our field crew gets to that by clicking on that third button of the button bar with the trowel on it. And then they start by selecting their context. So on the left-hand side, you would have, this one just has the general project area because I can't list sites, can't give you those numbers. But for most projects, you'll have a whole list of a bunch of sites that they'd be working on. They could pick their context on the large scale and then work down to the more specific context to either create or view and edit those. So I'm going to show you, we'll just pretend like we're going into trench number 3. This is the excavation detail layout. And these are all designed with quick training in mind. So often on the very first morning of a new field project, it's reserved for training staff, and then the crew immediately has to then begin excavating. So we wanted to make this really intuitive, and so the layouts are all really visually similar, with the same types of information showing up in the same places every time you're in a detail layout. So for us, on the first tab, you're going to be entering the descriptive information in, and then on the second tab, you get to associate, in this case, the trench with a context. You can do that with multiple contexts, so it can be associated with a lot of different things. And then the third tab is the photos and artifact bags. So this particular format with the 3 tabs is used across all of our detail layouts. So if you find a new feature, you'll enter the descriptive information first, and then all of the context where that feature is found second, and photos and artifact bags from the feature third. So this has made their interface, like I said, more intuitive, but it's also allowed for quicker learning and retention, which is really important because, like I said, we have temporary staff for every single project. And for the most part, we've tried to reduce some of the human error by having ID numbers auto-numbered. So then, if we're doing a new trench or a new bag or a new photo, all of those get a new number automatically. And we used to, back in the day, have paper lists that we would bring out, and if someone is working on a unit over there, they'd have to run over and grab the list and get the next number for an artifact bag and put the context in it. And you can imagine that sometimes you have duplicate bag numbers, sometimes they write down the context incorrectly. So having everything pushed, all the context information pushed into the bag number you get through a script, and it just collects all of that automatically. So then also there's no transcription errors and no paper. It's all born digitally. So I love this photo. This is day 1 of the project that I'm describing when I was training everybody in the field. And this is our project director, Brad, and our field director, Patty. And Brad is one of my success stories because he was initially very skeptical about adding a new technology to his rhythm. He really likes paper forms. He's kind of a grumpy person all the time. And it was interesting kind of coming up to him before the project started and saying, would you even be interested in using this on your project as a trial? And we ended up having a 45-minute conversation where he got to air a lot of grievances. And at the end of it, he said, this was nice. No one ever asks me what I want. They just come up to me and they say, this is our new technology, we're using it, we're implementing it across the board. And for him to feel like he was included in that process and given some kind of choice went a long way with him buying into being able to use it. That being said, we did start the project with both the iPad and the paper forms because he just wanted that backup. And the success is that on day 3, he told Patty, let's just stop using the feature forms. The database is working great. It's working better than these paper forms do, so let's just stop using it. So I felt really good about that. That was a good day for me. He also went back to our headquarters in Atlanta on day 3 of a 2-week project. So I knew that he was probably still feeling nervous, and so I wanted to create some project tracking as part of our excavation database. So on that first button, that general project layout, I have it set up so that managers can put in the projected level of effort for that project, and that would be the number of trenches outlined in a contract, or if we know the number of units we need to put in per site, they can put all that information in. And then clicking over to the second tab, they can keep track of the project as it's going along. They can log in and see what % of those things have been completed to that day, make sure that they're staying on schedule, even if they're not in the field. They can check in on that and see how people are doing. So that has allowed us to make sure that we're hitting the goals of our contracts as they're outlined. Our lab manager can also log in and see how many artifact bags are expected to return back to the lab, so she can start preparing for that. And if she wants to drill down even further, she can see what kinds of artifacts are going to be coming back and make sure that she has the appropriate ceramic analyst or lithic analyst on staff to address those artifacts when they get back. And you'll see, because of the summary data, it also allows end of field work reports to be written much more quickly because they don't have to do all these calculations, assemble everything themselves, and make sure that everything is on target. It's happening automatically. Project end, they just have to write it up. The last button at the bottom goes to some reporting tools, where again there's some summary information given on the side for how many of those things are out there, how many forms they're going to need to export essentially for each one of those different things, including all of our internal forms like this that people are familiar with seeing on paper. We just, again, cloned those essentially and put them in the print layout so that if they wanted to go in and see that nothing's been lost, it will all turn out okay. They could just click that button, see the form how they're used to seeing it, and that's been really nice. But these are actually legible because they're not handwritten, and we can export them as a PDF and append them to a report, or we can print them out and put them in a curation box at the end of the project. So FileMaker has allowed us to solve a lot of our fieldwork challenge, including navigating the complexities of state requirements, eliminating even the need to transcribe notes into a state form or for a colleague, and it has reduced a lot of the places that we were seeing human error creep into our process. And the user-friendly layouts help us really mobilize staff in a way that is cleaner, much more efficient. And kind of getting back at the idea of FileMaker as a workplace innovation platform, these particular successes in our field methods are starting to spill over into our broader business objectives and practices. So our board now has seen, they were a little nervous at first, but they've now seen the capabilities and the possibilities of using FileMaker and are starting to dream up other uses for it across our business. And so we've now developed a fleet tracker database where we can track our field vehicles going out and the mileage and the maintenance on those. And this fall we're going to be migrating our project management database out of Fourth Dimension into FileMaker. And yeah, just for the same reasons of getting those customizable and really robust things that FileMaker offers. So I hope this has given you guys a little bit of insight into the place of FileMaker in the cultural consulting world. And again, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts at the end of this, if you have any. So thank you very much.
So, my name is Stephanie Mizrahi, and I am an associate professor of criminal justice at Sacramento State, California, Sacramento State University in California. Go Hornets! And I'm talking today about how I use FileMaker in my research, and I do policy research in the criminal justice area. Who am I? Well, I'm one of those people who couldn't decide what they wanted to do with their life, so they kept going back for degrees. But I finally found a home, and I love what I do. I teach in both our law classes, and I also teach and research in Homeland Security, emergency management policies. I got into FileMaker actually when it was FileMaker 7, when I was starting to work on my dissertation, which ended up taking me quite a while. But when I was starting out, I had a professor that said, "You need a relational database." And I go, who? What? And he sent me to Access, which didn't go very well and didn't last for very long. I was on a website called Finish with basically a bunch of graduate students and PhD students across the country, and someone said, "Hey, FileMaker now has a relational database, try them." So I got FileMaker, and I got FileMaker Pro for Dummies, and managed to get my database to work. It's pretty basic, but I could not possibly have finished my dissertation without it. By the time I finished my dissertation, I was using FileMaker 11. I think by that time, somewhere around 12 or 13 was already out. As I said, it took me a little bit long to do my dissertation. Anyway, a couple of years ago, I decided to go back to this research and expand my database, potentially about 10-fold or more. And I go back into my FileMaker database and realize, I can't remember how I got these portals in here, and how did I get these relationships to work? And FileMaker Pro for Dummies, some of it wasn't much help. So I ended up at DevCon last year, mostly for the training day, and fell in love with the conference. Ended up staying for the whole thing. And my sincere thanks to Stephen Blackwell for encouraging me to apply to speak. And so here I am today. My research, in particular, at least for this database, is chemical and biological terrorism policy, and particularly the policy community that is involved in it. This is a fascinating area in policy for a couple of reasons. One, and I'm sure you'll be glad to know, these are very low probability consequent events compared to the other risks that we face as human beings on a daily basis. The chance of this happening is pretty low. The consequences, depending on the agent being used, could be horrendous. And we fortunately have not seen a true serious mass casualty event in this area yet. And so this makes for a very interesting decision-making context because you can't predict this. You can get out of the way of a hurricane if you have enough notice. You're not going to know necessarily not only when an event like this is going to happen, but the agent being used, the extent of it, the intensity. So a great deal of this is reactive. Decisions in the policy area usually result from interactions among the policy community, and that's what I study here. What in the world is a policy community? It's what it sounds. It's all the individuals and organizations that can be involved in a policy area, whether it's transportation, whether it's energy, in my area, chemical and biological terrorism, and are active at different points in time in that policy arena. And I've put up a list of some, and these are just some of the people that can be interested and be stakeholders in this. My research question focuses on the policy community itself. So a lot of policy researchers look at policy communities as a way of understanding policy change, the ultimate policy that is going to come out of their interactions. I look at the policy community itself, and what I want to know is, particularly after an event, how does the community itself change? In particular, the events that I looked at for this project were the 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway, and then, of course, the 2001 anthrax attack here. Fortunately, I've got a very small N in this area, and so there weren't a lot of events to choose from. Let's hope it stays that way. So I look at who participates in the community, who the members are, to what extent they participate over time, their intensity, and I call that timing. What topics do they address in the community? What are they talking about? And how do those ideas change over time, and particularly in reaction to an event? The way I do this is I look at congressional hearings. So I will admit I'm a little weird. I like reading congressional hearings for fun. However, trust me, it does give you a really good understanding of why Congress gets absolutely nothing accomplished. And what I look at is who appears at the congressional hearings, how often, and what they testify about. The current database is all hearings on chemical and biological terrorism from 95 to 2016. The revised version, and here is where the expansion gets pretty extensive, I am looking at building a database for all terrorism hearings, on actually all hearings on terrorism, homeland security, emergency management, domestic preparedness from 1981 forward. And the goal is to have this database as something that continues and constantly gets updated as we get the hearings from the committees at the end of each session. Why congressional hearings? There are some drawbacks here. Not everybody in the community is going to be called to testify at a congressional hearing. And I should mention these are federal, these are US Congress. A lot of that depends on who's chair of the committee and who he wants to bring forward, and some of that is what is their agenda. Some of these hearings, particularly in these fields, are classified, so we're not going to be able to get to them anyway. But generally in the literature, this is an accepted approach of looking at policy communities and getting a feel for who the players are. So what I did is I created a FileMaker app with about 4 main entities. The hearings, and just for simplicity, I used a day of testimony as a hearing. So some hearings can have 3 or 4 days of testimony to them, and each of those days will have its own hearing ID and be viewed as a separate hearing. The witnesses, including what is their position in an organization, what is their organization, and then I also type the witnesses. Are they federal government? Are they academic? Are they interest group? Trade associations, vendors, and businesses. So we get a lot of vendors that are interested in selling to the government things like scanners at airports, radiation detectors, things of that nature. And then I took excerpts from the witness testimony, literally the verbatim text from the hearings on what they talked about. And originally I did a sample of statements, basically tried to get every group at least once or twice a year of the main people that testified. The new database I'm going to go with every statement by every witness and excerpt their full text. So what I'm going to do is create a record for every paragraph in the statement, and that's going to be an excerpt. So you can see how this database is going to grow. So far, just with chemical and biological, this gives you an idea of how many hearings and witnesses and statements I ran across. And this is actually just the 10-year span between 95 and 2005. 5. So databases aren't much use unless it tells us something, particularly in research. So what did I learn so far from my research? Not surprisingly, about half of the statements over this period took place between 2001 and 2002. And even more than that, late 2001 to 2002, which of course is following, 9/11 and the anthrax hearings, or anthrax events. There was also quite a bit of attention paid to this area in 99 and 2000, and I think what happened there is that we had a number of programs that came in after the Tokyo sarin gas attack and after Oklahoma City as well, and the two kind of got conflated. So probably without Oklahoma City, Congress wouldn't have paid that much of attention to Tokyo because it was overseas, it didn't involve any American casualties, it was kind of an odd cult that was responsible for their act. But it came on the heels only a month before Oklahoma City, and so between the two, Congress started examining terrorism very broadly, including the WMD threat. It's a very expert and government-based community, probably not terribly surprising. There's not a lot of grassroots effort. That's very different than the nuclear power community. So for instance, after 3 Mile Island, you got a lot of grassroots groups developing, particularly on the environmental side, that were pushing to end nuclear power because it wasn't considered safe and no one wanted to live next to a nuclear power plant that could blow. We don't have that in this community. The events increased participation from the members rather than bringing new members in. Also, not surprisingly, the ideas and the themes intensified rather than changed much. You could pick up a lot of the recommendations that the experts were making in front of Congress in 1995 and 1999 and put them in 2001 and 2002 and 2003. Basically saying, see, we've been telling you this for over a decade or more, when are you going to listen? There's not a lot of disputes among the community members here. Some policy communities get very adversarial. They break into separate coalitions, and it's like, getting apples and oranges together. It doesn't happen. This one, you don't see that much. The disputes are over the devil in the details. So for instance, everybody fairly well agreed we need a better public health system. We need to better fund the the Epidemiological Intelligence Service, say that 3 times fast, and we need to increase our surge capacity and our medical stockpiles and the like. There would be disputes about some of the details, where those stockpiles should be situated. When we created the Department of Homeland Security, should CDC move into that or should it remain with Health and Human Services? Things of that nature. And this research allowed for some interesting contrast with other disaster communities. And so there's actually a sort of a subset of this kind of research that looks at disaster policy. And you can compare this with oil spills or the nuclear power accidents. So for instance, after Exxon Valdez, you have a very interesting combination of both environmental groups and the fishing industry coming together and saying, this can't happen again, and when it does, oil companies, you darn well better clean up after yourself. And those were usually 2 bedfellows you didn't see together very often. Future research and the ability to expand this FileMaker database will let me expand the models and the theories that I look at, because I'm going to be looking at far more members of the community. I can look at the existence of smaller groups in the communities. So within the terrorism community broadly, is there an aviation security community? Is there a separate WMD community? How does that divide up? I'm going to be able to look at specific key individuals, what we call policy entrepreneurs. Are there particular people in the policy community that drive change when something happens? People that are listened to, that are respected. And then I get to expand the time period and engage in comparisons with other communities. The ultimate goal with this revised database, and hopefully next year it'll be ready for prime time viewing, is to do a number of things that I've learned at DevCon 2017 and now 2018. So remember, I was working off of FileMaker for Dummies and FileMaker 7. So this is a very basic database. Many witnesses change jobs and positions. You've all heard about the revolving door of government experts. Well, it's very true. They'll go from a think tank back to government, back to defense contractor, and back and forth. So I'm going to have some joining tables that resolve that relationship and specifically identify organizations and their parents, as well as what witness they're affiliated with at any particular time. So I'm going to be separating out the person, John Doe from CDC, with a table that specifically says he was a witness at this time on this day where he was affiliated with this particular organization. I also, in the old database, coded every excerpt record by topic, and I had about 17 or 18 topics in there, each in its own field in the same record. Obviously, that's, as I've learned, going to create some searching problems for me, and so I'm going to be creating separate tables for topics and events, and then join them together whenever an excerpt mentions one of those topics or mentions one of those events. So you'll be able to search this database and see, all right, how many times was public health talked about this year, and did that increase or change, or did the topic change to chemical security, or, heaven forbid, a nuclear attack if that happens. I'm also going to be expanding and incorporating my growing understanding of layouts and designs. Much of that inspired by Deborah Zempel's wonderful talk yesterday. This was originally developed for me as the single user, so I didn't particularly care what it looked like. Ultimately, I would like students to be able to sign on to this and use this for some of their graduate research, as well as other faculty. I'm a two-developer show. This is my one assistant. So when I show you my quick database here, please do keep that in mind. He makes sure I take breaks at appropriate times. So hopefully you can get a bit of a view. I'll go a little bit higher here. So this is my hearing page, and this is hearing 76 right here. And this just gives the basic information of the committee that's holding the hearing and the date that it's being held. And then if I go to a witness, here's Mr. Robb from HHS. He's a federal government employee. And here's a list of all the hearings he testified at. And I can go from here and add in another hearing if I want to, and it'll give me the date of that hearing and create a statement record. Statement record isn't all that vital other than to join witnesses with the hearings they testified at. The biggest reason I fell in love with FileMaker is it gave me this. This was my most important page. It tells me who testified, when they testified, what organization they belonged to, the full text of their testimony, and as you can see, this is what's going to change with additional tables, the various topics that were talked about there. I'm one of those old school professors that really learns well by paper and writing things out and highlighting things. So I fell in love with FileMaker when I realized I could print these out as separate records and just take a big table and start sorting by type of witness, by date, by group, by topic, by anything I possibly wanted to do. Now, obviously, someone who's more interested in being able to do that on the screen and link it with other databases has those options in FileMaker as well, and some of those will be in the new database. So we'll leave my assistant for a moment. Also wanted to give some nice thanks to James Medema of Surefoot Consulting, who is helping me along with many other FileMaker mentors in developing this. Some of my plans, again, for the future, including being able to create the ability to use these on iPads, or probably iPads, because this is a lot of text for a mobile phone, and then students can go to a federal depository library with their iPads and start going through the joy of paper copies that are not available online. That's just for those who are interested. I put a screenshot on the PDF that will be loaded onto the FileMaker site. Most important part, why is this of interest to a FileMaker conference? For those of you who are developers and who have universities either as clients or are targeting universities or have the option for working with universities, don't just go to their admin offices. Go out to their faculty, maybe do presentations at the university, or possibly look at, let me bring this down a little bit, at some of the academic conferences, because this is a wonderful platform for faculty. Especially as we're now talking about this new API, there are a lot of other databases out there that faculty could build all their data collection in FileMaker and then link out to perhaps SPSS or Stata, which is our statistical stuff. There are brand new qualitative concept mapping software out there, and Vivo is now very popular. And if you could find some way to really store and organize your data and relate it among tables and then link it up with those other software programs, you have a very powerful tool for faculty that do research. If you've got a university that has a license, it allows them to make better use for it, especially if they have a university-wide license. They get a little bit more for their money. Obviously, the FileMaker support is very important for faculty. Other database programs just don't offer that, or some faculty are still trying to do all of this in an Excel spreadsheet and pulling their hair out. The other thing is that this works really well with this idea of the workplace innovation platform, because the three things that were mentioned, the ability to create and to share and to integrate, are exactly what faculty and researchers do. We're creating knowledge, ultimately, and we're creating information about human behavior, particularly in the social sciences, that hopefully informs better policies. At least that's the goal. If we can't share it with people, there's no point. We're not doing this for ourselves. We're doing it to extend our base of knowledge, to expand the discipline. And then again, the ability to be able to integrate with FileMaker with other platforms is an incredibly powerful tool that I think faculty will fall in love with. Very last point, if any of you are interested and are researchers or work with researchers that might be interested, we are looking at starting up a researchers user group. It'll be entirely virtual because it's open to anybody in the country. I'm working with Erica here on that, and possibly linking it up with hopefully a revised higher education user group as either a subset or closely related to. But these are researchers not just at universities, but if you're at think tanks or police agencies, government agencies that do research. And I will, there will be an update. I have a newer PDF that I will put up on this session that will replace the old one. And we're open to questions. And I actually left us 10 minutes.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by a policy entrepreneur?
A policy entrepreneur is a key person in the policy community outside of necessarily what agency or what group they work for. They're known across the community for their expertise. They have influence. They're able to basically talk people into things. And so when we have a window of opportunity for potential policy change, like an event like 9/11, it's potentially the policy entrepreneurs that will drive some change. There's some thought that if you don't have them, you're not going to get any change at all. So they're individuals that have particular power in the community. It depends on how familiar you are with the chemical and biological community, but a woman like Margaret O'Toole, who at one point was head of actually FDA, but she's very much a public health person, is very well known in the community, and she's been at a number of universities. Frank Cifulo, who at one point headed CDC, or was I don't remember if he was the head or one of the undersecretaries, and he's bounced around in that community for a number of years. So be people like that.
Hi, Stephanie. I just had a question to detail about your database. And are you keeping metadata on the original source materials? Like they're federal documents, so they're going to have lots of metadata.
Yes, it's going to depend. What these are literally the PDF copies of the congressional hearings that committees release, sometimes several months after the hearing. For those that are available online, I'm probably going to put a container field and link them into the database that way. There are some, particularly the earlier hearings, that are only available in paper copy, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be able to do with that.
Well, I was thinking that as federal documents, they probably have a federal record ID within the document itself.
I'm sorry, what?
Federal documents generally have to have some sort of reference ID in them that, it will be unique, at least within that agency or bureau that generated it.
Yeah.
So these are congressional documents. They're going to have some sort of congressional ID value so that, say you do, one of your students has, your app on his iPhone or whatever, and they go to DC or the archives or wherever they're at, and they say, I want to see XYZ. It's sort of like an ISBN number, except it's a
Some do, some don't. They do have a serial number that's basically the number that you would find in the library. Not a lot of them necessarily have like URL numbers or the things that will actually link to an electronic copy. Congress is almost about as non-technical as I am. So, and then some of the older hearings are just still paper. They've never been scanned in. So.
My question's for Teresa. On your application, I was curious if you either have or you're planning to integrate geocode data into your site records. And what caught my eye was the drawing where you have like the historical buildings kind of outlined in red and things like that. So we deal with some similar things with railroad property where they're going to dig. And we're starting to look at taking and collecting the geocode data, putting that into Tableau, and then we can look at a map and see where we've actually done work.
So for our history, we are I have a static map API that I'm using to generate that map based on the addresses provided by the surveyor. But in terms of the archaeology, we've decided to keep all of our GIS data outside of FileMaker in other apps on the iPad, either Esri Collector or Map Plus, so that we can create the shape files in those, export them as shape files back, and just leave the data collection side of things to the FileMaker app. That's how we have gone thus far. Some of that is because we don't always have signal, and so if we're trying to grab a GPS location, it may not be as accurate as we need it to be. A lot of times we need sub-meter accuracy on those things, and you can't always get that. So that's the route we've gone so far. I think that's the question, though, is how much do we put into FileMaker and how much do we leave our mapping separate? Yeah, maybe you can tell me if you've got ideas for that.
I don't know if I could tell you, but it just seems I was in an area as a young guy that had a lot of Indian archives and things like that in East Texas, and it would seem like it'd be interesting as you find these types of artifacts. Well, maybe we're in that same kind of region, and we need to maybe have a heads up.
Yeah, so I mean, there's different purposes behind all those things. You've got research archaeology, where you've got the research that's been done, and then you're just viewing it when you're in the field. It's, someone's collected that point on a garment or something like that, and it's put back into a database back in the office, probably. Our work is a little bit different because it's the contract archaeology side of things. We do thousands of sites a year, and so to keep things efficient, we're doing it once. So if we're out there, we're probably going to use a total station to get our spatial information for the most part, and we can then put those ID, the total station or the Trimble numbers in I didn't talk about that in mine, but we have on our feature layout, you can associate the number from our total station with that feature, so then when you're back in the office, you know what is connected. It doesn't visualize it though.
Anything else? Well, thank you very much. And
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Enjoyed it.